Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Multifamily with Veena Jetti, the amazing, the one and only. We have you here in our house today. I'm super excited to see you today again.
Same.
And today we're going to talk about the 4 things to look for when you are buying your next deal.
Yes.
So first of all, you mentioned the age of a building.
Yes.
Why that specific age?
So if you're looking at newer assets that are 2020 and newer, you're really in Class A, it's new construction. There's not really a whole lot of value add, hopefully, to be done on those. And if you're looking older than 1980s vintage, in 1970s, you start running into issues potentially like lead paint. You could have issues with boiler and chiller systems. The wiring on the plumbing can be copper tubing, which can be very expensive to fix. So you start getting more deferred maintenance the older the building is, and it becomes more expensive to operate. But again, it's a risk-adjusted return. So if you go into 70s or 60s vintage, you would expect to see a higher return than going into a 1990s or 2000 building. So that's why we like that building age, because there's lower deferred maintenance, and it's kind of the sweet spot between too old and too new.
Right. You're going to need something like old enough for you to add value, but
Yes.
like new enough for you to have a good place for the tenant.
Yeah, and like every 10 to 15 years, really the units should be renovated so that you're bringing it up to market. You're getting out of, whatever the trend was 10 years ago that might be old and ugly. You want to spruce it up, make it nicer, and change to whatever is happening at that time in the market.
That's right. And how do you know how many adjustments or modifications to a building are too much? Because it's so easy to just go and be like, you know what? I would love to have pink right here and so much carpet right here.
Yes.
And sometimes it can be too much and way too expensive. So how do you measure that?
That is a good question. So this goes back to the numbers, and I'm going to tell you. Okay, so anybody listening, get a pen and paper so you can write this down. This is one thing that I see all the time in new sponsors. They'll put out a pro forma where they're saying, okay, we're going to add granite, and we're going to add smart home packages, and we're going to add valet trash, and we're going to add all of these amenities. We're going to put all this money into each unit, and we're going to get an extra $3,000 a month in rent. And I look at it and I say, okay, there are areas where you can get $4,000 or $5,000 in rent. Is this that area? So you need to make sure that your tenant base in the 1, 3, 5 mile radius, whatever radius you're using, can afford your post-renovated rent.
That's right.
So the rule of thumb is typically 3x rent is what the income level has to be. So if you want to charge $1,000 for rent, that 1, 3, or 5 mile radius has to have $3,000 a month in income. So if the average income in that area is not $36,000, you're not going to be able to rent it for the $1,000. So you want to make sure whatever your post-renovated rent is affordable for your tenant base. That's one. The second thing that you want to do is you want to understand what your ROI metric is. So typically if you let's say you put $3,000 into a unit, and I'm making this number up, but let's say you put $3,000 into a unit. And let's say you're going to charge an extra $100 in rent every month for the $3,000 you put in. You want to count how many months it's going to take for you to get that $3,000 of investment back from that rent increase. So in this case, it would take you 30 months to get back your $3,000. So that's just under 3 years, which is what we look for, is under 3 years. We want to try to recoup the investment we made in. So the faster you get your money back, your return on your investment back, the better off you are. And the other unintended consequence, or I guess intended in this case, is that you add value to your bottom line, which is your NOI, your net operating income. And multifamily assets are calculated based on what the NOI of the asset is, because it's valued like a business, not based on what someone does. Exactly. So what your neighbor sells their property for doesn't really affect your property. It's really what the business can return for an investor.
Interesting. And it also allows you to have the opportunity to either like make it return even more than any other buildings in the area.
Yes.
Just because you made those smart changes.
Small changes. And a part of it too is when you're operating, you want to be recalibrating, because you might go into an asset thinking, hey, we're going to put granite throughout. And then you get into the asset and you find out people keep choosing the unit without granite. And because it's $20 cheaper or $50 cheaper, then you might learn that the $20 or $50 is not well spent getting granite, because you're going to have $20 or $50 less in rent.
Right.
So you keep that money and you spend it somewhere else. So maybe you learn that they'll spend an extra $75 a month for a smart home package. And that wasn't in your original plan. So you can pivot through the life cycle of your asset.
That's true. And you're basing that on what the tenant actually likes.
Exactly.
So what are some ways that you have found to like figure out that information, to get that input from the tenants, to figure out how to tailor your buildings better towards them?
Yeah. So if you go back to the numbers, it'll show you there, right? So you're going to look at what's your vacancy, what's your occupancy rate. The more tenants you have that are willing to pay for that, the higher your occupancy is going to go. And we use software that lets us do daily or weekly pricing. So what happens is it takes into account what every other asset in the area is charging. And then it also looks at our inventory and says, okay, you have two bedroom units coming up for rent and everyone else charging $1,300. You try charging $1,350 and see if someone takes it. Then let's say you come in, you say, oh no, $1,350 is too much. We're not renting it there. Okay. Then the next person comes in and we might say, okay, now we're going to adjust the pricing down to restabilize our occupancy. So now it'll be $1,325. So we try to hit that sweet spot of maximizing rent, but making sure our occupancy is high enough. And so a lot of times it is trial and error with getting feedback from tenants about what they like, what they want to see. So we take a lot of surveys, we take a lot of feedback from our residents, and we take it seriously because if it's an easy change for us to implement, we'll go ahead and implement it. We look at search terms. So for example, in our assets, the most common search term with apartments is pet friendly.
Oh.
So we know we need to pay attention to pets. So we try to always make sure there's a dog park. We try to make sure that there's a pet washing station. It's really cost effective and easy to add a pet washing station. We try to maintain pools. So we want to make sure the amenities are really there for our residents as well.
That's awesome. And it's super cool that you always tailor it to them to make sure that they are super happy on the building that you're going to be staying at.
Always a leave.
Yeah, for sure. And now when it comes to the tenants though, what are some of the characteristics that you look for in the tenants or the professionals that you're looking for when you're interviewing them?
Yeah, we want really stable tenants. We want tenants that care about their credit. We want that. Usually we're the last stop on the way out to homeownership. So they're there because they are just moving to the area. They don't know where they want to live yet, or they want the school district and they're getting a house built or renovated, or they're looking for the right home. So that's usually our tenant base. So it's usually professionals, young families, or like I said, dinks where they're double income, no kids. They want a nice area. They don't want the upkeep of renting. And we're starting to see more and more people preferring to rent because they want to be able to pick up and move whenever they want. So we really look for those stable tenants, stable jobs. Whenever I walk assets, and this kind of changed during COVID, but before COVID, what I would do is I would look at the parking lot and I would see how many cars are there in the middle of the day because I want there to be no cars because I want everyone to be at work somewhere, right? But I also looked at the cars to see how they keep their cars. Are there a bunch of rusting cars or are there nicer vehicles? One of the assets we bought recently, there are like Mercedes and Acura, and those are nice cars that we don't typically see at Class B assets, but this tells me this is a really good location. And those tenants really care about the property and it shows. They keep it clean. They don't, put trash anywhere. And so it's just a really nice asset to be able to walk into. So you want to see those tenants that care about this, that treat it like home, that want to live in a clean and community, in a nice community. Maybe they have kids that they want to be able to play outside. So maybe there's a playground. So it depends on each asset, but we're generally looking for that, middle class family to come and stay with us on their way out to homeownership.
That's true, especially for the stability side of things. Because I feel like as an investor, it's always really good to know how good your investments are performing, and that's a good way to know for sure.
Yes, absolutely.
And also, you mentioned that you look at the cars. What other tiny little tips do you look at like when you're like trying to invest on a certain building?
Yeah, so we look at the cars. I actually talk to the residents when I'm walking an asset, if I see them. And it depends sometimes I get to secret shop the asset. So then I'll be like, oh, my sister is moving here and I'm trying to, help her decide, what do you think of the area? And it's amazing what residents will tell you. And I do this on every tour I go on. I'll ask them, I'll be like, okay, do you like it here? Do you feel safe? Does the management care? What would you improve? Is there a better asset somewhere that I should be looking at? So I ask them all those questions. I'm like, okay, and when there's an issue, how quickly do they respond to work orders? Because I don't actually mind if there's mismanagement. That is an opportunity for us. I want to know about it going in so I can prepare for it. So that's one thing I do. I always always look in the area around. I always drive around it to see whether there's, Starbucks, Costco. I want to see what kinds of stores are there. Usually if there's like a check cashing place or like places that have like bars on the windows, it's not as low crime. Yeah. So I do look for that because our tenant base that we try to target isn't really going to live in those areas.
Right. And you mentioned crime, and I feel like that's a really important aspect of like all the research that you're doing before purchasing a property. Yes. So what are some other ways that you assess the crime rate during your tours?
Yeah, so you can Google and find out, what crimes have happened in the area. You can see if there were any violent crimes or sexual crimes that have happened in the area or within a certain mile radius. So we always do look to that. One thing I will say about multifamily though is it doesn't matter how nice the asset is. High density living always is going to raise some amount of crime in no matter how nice it is. It doesn't matter. What really matters is how does management respond to it and how does management address it, right? Because we want to make sure that our residents are safe. Like I said, they're at home and I want them to feel safe at their home. That's right. So if we have an issue, we try to address it right away. You'll see a lot of units that'll put up gates. They'll maybe have security. They might have security lights, cameras, stuff like that are all things that we can do as sponsors and operators to ensure the safety of the building.
Right, and it's really cool that it's not that big of an investment either way.
No.
But you already know from the tour that you just did before purchasing the building, what are some of the things that you need to implement. Yes. That's why it's really important to have a tour again then. Now, what are some other of the characteristics that you look for in the building itself? Yeah,
so the building itself, we basically want to see that there's minimal deferred maintenance. Okay. I want to make sure that, roofing is generally looking nice. We'll have our engineers or inspectors come out before we even put an LOI in if possible.
Oh, interesting.
We look at building systems. So I always look at the AC units, see how recently they've been replaced, if they're going to need to be replaced again, because that can be expensive
really
cost very quickly. Yes. So we want to make sure that when we're doing our due diligence, we look to see what are the things that you've been repeatedly addressing? Like in unit 402, have you been going back and answering a plumbing call in the kitchen for the last 4 months? Maybe there's an issue there that needs to be addressed. So we'll take a deeper dive into that and look at that. When we do our due diligence, we'll also look to like the ceilings and the walls and see if there's any water spots. Is there a leak somewhere behind the walls? So we want to make sure we're documenting all of those things and making sure we really understand what we're getting into before we go into the property.
And is it ever like a turn off kind of thing? Like when you see like all of these many little problems within a building, like have you seen a building that was like way too damaged that you were like, no, there's no way that I can even flip it?
All the time.
And how do you know how many like little things you can fix and how many you can't?
Well, it comes down to the numbers, right? So if I have to spend $5 million fixing up a property, if I know that ahead of time and I put that assumption into my model and the returns are still high enough for me to bring investors into it, there's no issue there. If I put the $5 million in after I buy the asset and it's a surprise expense, then that's a problem. So always go back to your numbers and see in your numbers, are you able to actually return what you think you're going to return? And nothing ever goes the way you think it's going to. So always plan for contingencies. We always have a contingency budget and then we have an extra margin for error in estimation of costs too.
For sure. How much should a beginner investor start planning on as a contingency budget kind of thing if they wanted to buy a multifamily building?
We typically will plan for anywhere from 10 to 15%. I would say a new investor, the more you can plan, the better off you're going to be. No investor is ever mad when you give them too much money back. So you should always err on the side of being conservative.
That's true. It's better to have more than
not
little.
Enough. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Any last tips for someone that is looking to invest in a new multifamily unit?
Go back to the numbers. You're going to hear me say this pretty much on every podcast we ever do because it's that important that you go back to the numbers. If your numbers are saying that you can do it, then great. But if they're saying you can't, don't try to tweak the numbers to make it work because it will not be a good result in the long run. So I think the numbers are the most crucial thing, understanding your business and also knowing that the more you walk assets and the more assets you see, even if you're not buying them, the more you see, the more ideas you're going to have, the better idea you'll have of what you can do in the area. We always comp shop. So whenever we are buying an asset or considering buying an asset, we actually go in and look at what the nearest 4, 5, 6 competitors are doing. We secret shop those. So then I'll go and be like, hey, my sister's moving here. We want to see it. And so that's what we do. Awesome. Yeah, that's what we do to make sure that our numbers are in line with what the market is. We can see what other competitors are doing if they have nicer units, or maybe their units are smaller, but ours are more outdated. So we can kind of play with those things and bring them up to market.
Sure. It kind of gives you ideas. Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you so much again, Veena. And it's super cool to always learn more about multifamily. Yes. We're excited to learn more about that.
Me too.
And thank you to our audience. And we're going to see you on the next episode. Bye-bye.